All right, please go ahead and be seated. Turn with me to Mark chapter 11. Mark chapter 11. And as I mentioned last week, so this is a three-parter just because that's the way the text has laid it out for us. That's the way Mark has given it to us. And last week, we kind of, so Mark oftentimes uses what's called a sandwich technique, something like A, B, A, or something. So you have the inner portion, and then you have that inner portion surrounded by two outer portions, and that's called the sandwich technique. So Mark gives us a lot of Markan sandwiches. You'll hear people talk of it in that way. And that's what we saw last week. We saw the outer part. The outer part of what we're looking at today was the fig tree. So the fig tree we saw last week when Christ, he comes to a fig tree. He's wondering why that fig tree doesn't have fruit. He curses the fig tree. And so in between the fig tree incident was Christ going to the temple. And in the temple is where we are today. So this is 15 through 19. So let's read this, Mark 11, 15 through 19. Then they came to Jerusalem. So they came right after, this is right after Christ is looking for fruit on the fig tree, doesn't find it. And then after that, they come to Jerusalem. And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. Verse 17, and he began to teach and say to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a robber's den. The chief priests and the scribes heard this and began seeking how to destroy him, for they were afraid of him, for the whole crowd was astonished at his teaching. Then verse 19, when evening came, they would go out of the city. And that's when they went out of the city. After that, that's when he curses the fig tree on the following morning. So that's why, so you really have, as I mentioned last week, the temple is, so a lot of times we've all heard of this incident. Christ goes into the temple, he starts flipping the tables and you know, wreaking havoc on the money changers. We're all aware that this happens in the life of Christ, except the people maybe who do The Chosen. I don't know if they have that episode or not. But this is a very controversial section. Some of y'all got that, right? This is a section that makes us uncomfortable, because this is not, when we see Christ, this does not fit our general American perception of who Christ is. And then the question becomes, well, why is he doing this? Why is he wreaking havoc? Why is he expressing himself with such indignation and anger and even wrath, right? So you're looking at this, and there are questions to answer here. But as we saw last week with the parable when he curses this fig tree, and as I mentioned last week, there were people when Christ curses the fig tree. There are people like Bertrand Russell. Granted, he's not a Christian, but even Christians. Who's the guy? Barclay, William Barclay. He's a commentator. So I was looking at what he had to say about the fig tree passage. And Barclay is uncomfortable with what Christ does to the fig tree as well. And so we see that this is, a lot of times we try to make Christ fit our understanding of who he is, rather than look at the scriptures and say, okay, this is what the scripture gives us. What does it mean now? And so last week we saw that when he curses that fig tree, it was a parable. Because of the sandwich technique, it was a parable of Christ going to the temple and cleansing the temple. And the reason why that itself is also a parable is because when Christ goes into the temple, whenever he starts to cleanse the temple, this is not just about cleansing the temple of money changers. This is pointing to something else as well. And we're going to get to this as we go on, especially to when we get to verse 16. But let's start here. So this is a parable of judgment. Okay, that's what we're really going to hone in here, and we're going to see that Christ is giving us a parable of judgment here. So when I say parable, I'm not saying it didn't happen. It really happened, but it's pointing to something as well. Okay, so verse 15, let's look at this. So they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple. Now, is this the first time that he entered the temple? That's the first question. It's not. Remember that the first night he goes into the temple, and he's looking around and he's inspecting things. He's checking things out, and then he goes back. And we talked about it last week. Why does he go and inspect things and then he doesn't do anything? Well, now here comes the response to his original assessment of the temple from the night before. So here he is, verse 15. He enters the temple, and that's when he begins to drive out those who are buying and selling in the temple. He's overturning the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. Here's the first thing about this temple. You might have in your translation, it might say the temple area. And it's because he's in what's called the court of the Gentiles. So it's the temple area before you actually enter into the sanctuary, that kind of thing. You have this big outer court. And the outer court is massive. I had no idea it was this massive until you start looking into it. But it was 500 yards long, 325 yards wide. So think about, 5 football fields, and 5 football fields long, 3 football fields wide. So this is a massive area, and so 35 acres. And inside this area called the Court of Gentiles, there are merchants. They're selling sheep. They're selling their doves. And the reason for this is because when you make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, you're not bringing your animals with you, right? So when you go into the temple, you're going to sacrifice animals. Well, if you're coming from Bethlehem, if you're coming from Capernaum, you're not bringing your animals with you to sacrifice. So it's for convenience sake that they're setting up in the temple, because when you buy these animals, you also know that these animals are clean because they've been inspected. They've already been inspected, so it's convenience. I go into this temple area, I can buy these animals, I know they're clean. In other words, I know I'm not going to go to the priest, and the priests are not going to turn me away because I bought this in the I bought this in the courtyard of the temple. I didn't bring this. It's not like it's my own livestock. So it's for convenience sake. The problem, though, is this. One of the problems, anyways, is that they're selling, for instance, the doves for a shekel of gold. So that's a controversial move even in those days. So there's rabbis that in the days of Christ are debating and arguing with each other regarding the propriety of selling these animals for a high price, or a higher price than what was normal. Okay, so that's the first thing. So that is taking place. We're gonna be looking at all of this in a minute. The other thing that's taking place is that when you come from, again, I mean, think about the Ethiopian eunuch. He's coming from Africa, right? Well, what kind of coin does he doesn't use the coins that they're using at the temple. So when he comes to the temple, he's having to exchange his coins for what's called the Tyrian shekel. So it comes from Tyre, but the Tyrian shekel is the closest thing to the Hebrew shekel, which is required by Exodus 30. So you have to, in order to exchange money, you have to have the right coinage in order to buy or to spend money on, let's say, the dove or the sheep or the goat. I have to have the currency. So they're not just exchanging currency, they're exchanging currency for a certain price, a certain rate. So that's the other thing. So you're seeing some of that. Okay, they are charging interest also. And here's the rub, here's the catch. This is why Christ is going to be in hot water by the end of this. In verse 18, they're going to start seeking how to destroy him. Why? Well, because number one, this is a very lucrative business. Josephus tells us in AD 66, so 30 years after this, more or less, in AD 66, during Passover week, there were 255,000 lambs sacrificed at the temple. 255,000 lambs. So this is a big business. Okay, here's the other thing. Guess who's in charge of overseeing the operations and the business of what's going on in the courtyard? None other than Annas the high priest. None other than the Sadducees. None other than the political class that is already after Jesus Christ, already at his throat, right? So now you have a situation where it is a charged environment. If you come in, and we all know, I mean, this is just human affairs. This is how we operate. If you come in and you try to disrupt something as far as finances, economics, anything like that, then that is the golden cow. If you do that, what's going to happen? Well, the machine, the system is going to come for you. And that's in the natural realm. That's in the secular world that happens, right? It's that same way in the spiritual world as far as this religious world as well. So let's go to verse 16, and now we're going to see exactly what the problem here is. So he would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. And now, usually, when people look at this, they say the problem that Christ has is the commercialization of religion in the religious courtyard, in the religious temple structure. Have we all heard that? Does that make sense? So in other words, you'll hear people and they'll say, well, the problem is that they were trying to secularize this court of the Gentiles. They were selling things. They were making money. Now, there is a problem with the way they were going about this, no doubt. But the reason why I'm going to argue that that's certainly not everything that's going on here. I wouldn't even say that's the main issue that's going on here. That is an issue as far as the oppression and the exploitation of people. That's a problem, yeah. But as far as just the fact that they're actually setting up a place to sell animals, that in itself, I would argue, is I'm not going to say permissible, but that was common. Because in Deuteronomy 14:22 through 26, it does say that it shows that people are expected to have a place where they can buy animals when they come to this place that God establishes. So that's not unheard of, right? Mary, when you think of Mary, they have Jesus. They bring Jesus to the temple in Jerusalem. Mary does not have a personal dove collection at her house. She has to go and buy those doves somewhere. So it makes sense that they would have something like that to provide for people that don't have the opportunities to just take doves from their own personal stash of doves. So when they go to the temple, that's what's going on. The other reason why, there's a few more reasons why I would argue that there's certainly more going on here, is because remember the Gospel of John. And this can be, again, this is something where people look at this and they're like, look at this, John, somebody made a mistake here. Because how many times does Jesus go to the temple and overturn the money changers and run everybody out in the Gospel of John? You know how many? Two. 2 times. Not just 1 time, 2 times. He does it at the beginning of his ministry, and he does it again at the end of his ministry, that's where we are now. So why does he do it 2 times? What is going on with that? And I mentioned last week what was called a jealousy inspection, or the priests in Leviticus 14. Look at this right here. So this is Leviticus 14, verse 39. And this is regarding leprosy in a house. So God starts out in verse 34, when you enter the land of Canaan, which I give you for a possession, and I put a mark of leprosy on a house in the land of your possession, then the one who owns the house shall come and tell the priest, saying something like a mark of leprosy has become visible to me in the house. And so the priest shall then command that they empty the house before the priest goes in to look at the mark, so that everything in the house need not become unclean. And afterward the priest shall go in and look at the house. Watch it. He's going to start inspecting this house. So he shall look at the mark, and if the mark on the walls of the house has greenish or reddish depressions and appears deeper than the surface, then the priest shall come out of the house to the doorway and quarantine the house for 7 days. The priest shall return on the 7th day and make an inspection. Okay, that's the first inspection. So he's going to this house and he's looking, he wants to see a clean house. That's what he's inspecting, that's what he's looking for. If the mark has indeed spread on the walls of the house, then the priest shall order them to tear out the stones with the mark in them and throw them away at an unclean place outside the city. He shall have the house scraped all around inside, and they shall dump the plaster that they scrape off at an unclean place outside the city. Then they shall take other stones and replace those stones, and he shall take other plaster and replaster the house, right? So in other words, he comes, he inspects it, he finds that, okay, there's some uncleanness. Let's take out the dead parts, let's put in some fresh stones in here, and let's see if that helps. Verse 43, if, however, the mark breaks out again in the house after he has torn out the stones and scraped the house, and after it has been replastered, then the priest shall come in and make an inspection, the second inspection. He does it again. If he sees that the mark is indeed spread in the house, it is a malignant mark in the house, it is unclean. In verse 45, this is exactly what's to take place to this big, beautiful, glorious temple. Look at verse 45. He shall therefore tear down the house, its stones, and its timbers, and all the plaster of the house, and he shall take them outside the city to an unclean place. In other words, that house is no longer clean. That house has been declared a house upon which judgment is to fall. When Christ is inspecting the temple, and he's going in the temple, he's in and out of the temple, and you're like, what's going on here? There's something like this that's taking place. Over here in Leviticus, that's a type of inspection jealousy that Christ himself is applying to the temple. Just like we saw last week, we talked about before God comes and destroys or disperses Babel, the Tower of Babel. It says that God first, what does he do? He goes down and inspects. He looks around. He examines what's going on. Before he destroys Sodom and Gomorrah, what does he do? He goes down, he inspects. Same thing, before he comes and brings judgment on the temple, he's inspecting the temple. Is the religious system, is it operating in accordance with the way that I have designed it, the way that I intended it? That's what Christ is doing here. He's inspecting things, and so whenever he is looking at it and he has decided that no, the temple is not operating in the way that it was meant to operate, and so that's where Christ begins, back here in Mark chapter 11, he enters the temple and begins to drive out those who are buying and selling in the temple, overturning the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And the other reason for this is this. You remember how massive this place is. So sometimes people talk like this will somehow just grind everything to a halt as far as what's going on there. He can't go around, 500 yards long and 325 yards wide of merchandise and merchants and go around and flip all of the tables. So what he's doing here is it's a parabolic demonstration. It's just like the prophets in the Old Testament. They would do things. Ezekiel would walk around naked. Others would lay on their side. They're doing things as to say this is what's to happen. This is what's to take place. So when Christ is doing this, yes, there is a problem, as we'll see with the exploitation and the greed, etc. There is a problem. But the bigger picture is Christ is declaring himself to be the king of the temple, the Lord of the temple. And the Lord has come and he has consigned judgment on the temple because the temple is not doing what it's supposed to do. So even if there is a reaction, and obviously this gets the attention of the high priest, that's the point. But there is more to it than just the commercialization protest. He's prophesying about what's about to happen. Remember, because he just cursed the fig tree. The temple religious system is about to be destroyed. Look at verse 17. Now this again shows in verse 17 why this is not just about a commercialization protest, a protest of the courts being used in a monetary way. Because verse 17, if you're like, well, and it was kind of like a trick question when it's like, okay, so why is he going around flipping tables? Well, by God's grace, he tells us why. He tells us exactly why. In verse 17, look what he says. And he began to teach and say to them, is it not written, number 1, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. Number 2, but you have made it a robber's den. He gives us the 2 reasons why he's upset. The 2 reasons why the Lord of the temple has declared that that the temple is not operating in the way that it's meant to operate. The first thing, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. What's he talking about there? Well, he gives us a reference to Isaiah 56. This is from Isaiah 56. When you go back, you read Isaiah 56, the context is about what Israel is to be after they are sent into exile. They're sent into exile for their disobedience, for their perversions, for their rebellion against God. And so Babylon comes in and will take them into exile. But upon their returning, that's why Isaiah is often called the Gospel of Isaiah. It's good news. They're going to return. So when they return, what is Israel supposed to be like when they return? Well, you see this throughout the Gospel of Isaiah, the book of Isaiah. They're to be a light to the nations. They're to be a place where the inclusion of proselytes is a very common, ordinary thing. People are going to flock to this place. Gentiles, the nations, they're going to flock. That's what it's supposed to be. And here's the thing. Look what happens. If you go back to the Abrahamic covenant, that's exactly the way it was always designed. Abraham was meant to be a blessing to whom? All the nations, a blessing to all the families of the earth. You see this in Galatians when Paul's talking about this, that this is what the Abrahamic covenant was not meant to just be for the ethnic Israelites or people living in Palestine. It was meant to go and be a blessing to all the world, all the people in the world. Even pre-fall, think about Adam. And you get this from guys like G.K. Bill and others, and they'll argue, they'll say, okay, when God tells Adam to be fruitful and multiply, to go forth and subdue the earth, what's he saying? To be a blessing to all the world through the gospel. So this is the way that God has always intended the church to operate, Israel to operate. God dwells with Israel for the sake of the world. It's another way to say it. Think about Nicodemus' problem when Christ goes to Nicodemus. And eventually you get to John 3:16, right? In John 3. And Nicodemus, Christ says, for God so loved the world. Right? And we're like, okay, well that means that Christ died for everybody. And you'll hear these arguments. Christ is talking to a man who has been brought up in a tradition or with the ideology, the mindset that salvation is only for the Jews, not for the world. So Christ is saying, for God so loved the world, the nations, the Gentiles. And for a Jewish mind in the first century, by and large, they will not be able to comprehend that. Why? Because the Gentiles are the enemies. The Gentiles are unclean. The Gentiles are you don't have any interactions with Gentiles. And so when Christ is going to the temple, he's realizing this is what the temple has become. Rather than becoming a beacon of hope for all the nations, for all the world, the Great Commissions to spread through Israel or from Israel, rather than that, what do you have? When you go into the temple in the first century, in the days of Christ, when you go into that temple, instead of the Gentiles being brought in, you know what you have? You have a court on the outside, basically the outer court, the court of the Gentiles. Why do they get the court that's furthest removed from the inner sanctuary? Well, because they're not like us. They're not they're not ethnic Israelites. So they get a little portion, right? It's almost like the temple's not really for the Gentiles, but since we've got to give them something, we'll give them a little. Give them the outer side. That's why in Ephesians 2, when Paul's talking about the wall of hostility has been broken down, the wall of separation has been broken down in the gospel. What's he talking about? Well, in the temple at this time, there was a sign that said, if you're a Gentile and you pass through this area, you are consigned to death. You will lose your life. You can love Yahweh all you want. You can be a circumcised Gentile. But if you're a Gentile and you cross this right here, you're going to be put to death. That's what Christ is talking about. He's looking around. He's examining this. And it's really, in a sense, even more ludicrous because believing foreigners they always had access to the altar in the Old Testament. Leviticus 22, Numbers 15. It talks about when foreigners, when Gentiles, when people from other nations, when they come in, they're to be welcomed in. And so it's not like this is some new thing. It's not some brand new thing. This is the way that it was meant to be. Leviticus 22, Numbers 15. So it's basically a sense of uber nationalism, ultra nationalism. The Messiah is expected to crush the head of the nations around us. Right? Well, okay, in a sense that's true, because he's king and he's ruler. There's a day of judgment coming. But in another sense, that's horrendously not true, because Christ came to what? Offer salvation to the nations. He came to offer good news to the nations, to the Gentiles, to the unclean people. That's what he came to do. So that's where you have the irony. So they're thinking Christ is going, when the Messiah comes, what's he going to do? He's going to crush the Gentiles. Instead, when the Messiah comes, when Christ comes, what does he do? He starts making space for the Gentiles in this outer court. How come they're not allowed to do what they've been called to do? How come they're not allowed to have access to Yahweh, according to you guys? So that's what you have. Now here's the thing. Let's hone in just a little bit, and we look at this, and it's easy for us to look at this and say, well, those guys were out of their minds. What are they? So because what they become is very exclusivistic. They exclude everybody but themselves. They become very narrow, very sectarian. That's what the Pharisees, the Sadducees, right? That was the biggest problem. They become very narrow, very, very, very hard, exclusivistic, very cold towards anyone who's not like themselves. Now, to hone in and bring this home just a little bit, okay, this is not something that only happens to Pharisees and Sadducees. This can happen to all of us, anybody, at any time. It can happen, especially, let's say, like in Reformed churches, okay? And I've mentioned this, I know, a few times, but it's like, okay, so often, and I know it for myself, when I'm out evangelizing or talking to somebody, a lot of it's like, man, you've never heard of John Calvin? You've never heard of you have no church history background, you don't know about any of this? And in a sense, it's very easy to kind of be puffed up and look down upon this person. And so, so it's okay. We want to train people and teach people about these things, about the history of the church. And we do that. We just went like a year and a half of church history. So it's important. It's critical. Theology is critical, right? But at the same time, we know how often we can come to a place where it's like, okay, you're not a Reformed Presbyterian, then I don't know if I can hang out with you. You're just a regular Christian? I don't know, man. I would rather hang out with these guys who are Reformed Presbyterians. Or, sometimes it's like, and even within Reformed Presbyterian, or you can do the same thing with 1689 or whatever. It's like, okay, well, what kind of Reformed Presbyterian are you? Oh, you're not a post mill? Well, we can't. You're not an mill. You're not. You go down the list. You're not. You mean that you're a prelapsarian? There's a church down the street that'll be better for you then. Not our church, right? And that's the mindset. It's so easy to come. It's like, because we know this, everyone else is dumb and unclean and different and second tier. And that's how, and again, this is a Reformed church, so that's why I'm mentioning this. It happens think about it. This is the beauty of like a church plant compared to an established church. Established churches, it can become very easy to all of a sudden we get comfortable with just ourselves. And anyone who comes in from the outside who hasn't been with us for a while, we can become very skeptical and cautious, and we can say, well, who are they? You know, they have to earn their way in before we'll accept them and embrace them as brothers. And that can happen in established church. That can happen in any church. But that happens quite a bit. You know, just the mindset, the mentality becomes very isolated. And you don't come out and say it, but that's the culture and the tendency of the established churches, in a sense. That's what, think about this. Israel did not begin in the way that they became. Okay? In the days of Abraham, it wasn't like that. It was very much the sense of, okay, the blessing is to all the nations. We're to reach all the nations. In the days of Daniel, it's not like that. Daniel has that mindset. It's for the nations. He's witnessing to people wherever, you know, in that situation. Jonah, look at Jonah. Did Jonah have that problem? Jonah did have that problem. He don't want to go to Nineveh. These are the enemies. These are the bad guys. The salvation's not for these guys. Even if it was, I don't want them to have it. But eventually, he realizes, okay, gets his head on straight, gets swallowed by a whale, all of that. Eventually he goes to Nineveh. Why? Because God's plan is to use Jonah and the nation of Israel to spread the gospel from there. God's plan in the churches, right, is not just to be this like social club amongst ourselves. It's to go and to reach the city of Lubbock, to go and reach the state of Texas, to go and reach the country that we live in and the world. Because the gospel salvation is not just for Reformed Presbyterians or people that are in our family or people of this church, right? It's to all the ends of the earth. So we need, in other words, the mindset is that. The mindset is there will be people that aren't exactly like us. They don't know everything we know. Maybe they know more, right? Maybe they don't know more. Maybe there's people, you know, they don't dress like us. They come in from the, you know, they come in off the streets or something. They have face tattoos and big old earrings, and I mean, who knows? We're like, well, they certainly, and I'm not, you know, what's nice about us is I haven't felt this tendency where it's like, oh, you know, everything has to, but I think we all understand this happens in churches, and that culture can be very pervasive and insidious, and it happened in the days of Christ. That was the problem. They became very exclusivistic. Only our types. That's who God really loves. So we have to watch for that. Always have to watch for that. This is why one of the guys that really helped me and still does as far as church plants go, he's an OPC church planter or missionary, but he was telling me, he said, and this shocked me, but he said, you know, it's very important that you don't go from being a mission church to a particular church too fast. And I was like, well, okay, I understand some of that, right? I mean, there's some wisdom there. But one of the reasons why he said that, and this is what surprised me, is because if the church, if it develops like an established, settled church mindset, it will not grow anymore. A lot of times, it becomes insulated and inward focused, and that's true, and that's what we're going to have to really wrestle with in Clovis. You know, as we particularize there, and it's like we cannot lose the focus here. Even as an established church. The mission is not just the inward aspect of the church. There is the inward aspect, don't get me wrong, but there's also the outward aspect. There's also the sense in which not everyone, you know, we want to reach people that are not just Reformed Presbyterians. We want to reach lost people, period. We want to reach people who are nominal Christians and don't even know it. And then they come in and they have no idea what's going on. They've never sang the Gloria Patri. So we teach them, we spend some time with them, we help them along, that kind of thing, right? So that's what's going on here. And it's easy, man. Look, for the Pharisees and the Sadducees here, right, and for us as well. I've read books. I've talked to people, and they'll say that they don't want the church to grow. And I know you're like, well, wait a minute. Why would you not want your church to grow? Because it's inconvenient. It's hard work when the church starts to grow. Why? Because you're going to guess what you're going to have? Immature Christians. Christians that don't see things the way that you see them. It becomes much more complicated, much more difficult, requires a lot more work. So they're like, you know what? I think we're good with like 50 people, and because we know everybody. In Clovis, the church we meet in Clovis, their phrase is like a small church with a big heart. It's like, why would that be your motto? A small church with a big heart. You know? And it's not to say we should be shooting for a mega church. But the idea is like, you know, I mean, any kind of mindset where we're insulated and we have that inward focus That's what's going on with the Pharisees. That's what's going on with the Sadducees. Anything outside of us is bad, it's unclean. Churches fall into that all the time. So we have to watch that we don't fall into that. This is also why, in a sense, this is why it's nice that we don't have a building. Because we have to kind of be on our toes all the time. We can't get settled. We can't get too comfortable. We can't just go through the motions here. There's a lot of there's a mission mindset. You look around and you're like, well, this is clearly not the church this is not the end game yet. We haven't reached the goal yet, clearly. It's like, think bigger. So in some of those videos, I'm thinking, when people watch the videos and they see think bigger and, like this, like, oh man, there's our motto right there. They're like, what is that? But you guys get the point. It's nice in a sense because we can't be comfortable. We know that our focus, and it's unconscious, right? But we know that, hey, this is not the goal. That's why it's the beauty of this. Don't you, and I was thinking of this, don't you think that was part of the problem, okay, when in the beginning you have a tabernacle that's on the move? It's you break it down and then you set it up, and they're never really comfortable. They're always on the move, and then all of a sudden now they get settled, they get established, they get a temple, and then what? And God even brings us up. You guys start getting comfortable, you start getting spiritually lazy and sluggish, you start compromising and being corrupted by the world, and then what does God do? He comes and destroys that nation, that temple, and they build a new one. Same thing. So there's so much there. Let's look at the next part. This is from Jeremiah. Jeremiah 7, where he's talking about the den of robbers. So the first thing is that they've become inward focused and they've lost sight of the gospel, the mission. The mission is to all the nations. Number 2 is what Jeremiah tells us, that it's become a den of robbers. This is Mark 11, verse 17. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a robber's den. Now, again, you're thinking financially, right? They're in here, they're exploiting people, they're charging people more interest than they should. There is that, but this term, as far as what it means to be a den of robbers, is much broader than that. It means bandit. It means an outlaw. And the road to Jericho, from Jericho to Jerusalem, remember Christ has just traveled that road. That road from Jericho to Jerusalem was the most notorious road in Palestine for robbers and bandits. And so Christ comes into this temple and he says, listen, the most dangerous road in Palestine is not the road from Jericho to Jerusalem. The most dangerous place in Palestine is right here in this temple. This is a hideout for those robbers. Those robbers that are the highwaymen on the streets over here, this is where they hang out. This is where they fester. This is their getaway. So he's making a claim about what the temple's become here. And in the context there, in Jeremiah 7 through 1 through 14, chapter 7, 1 through 14, the people there, although they're corrupt inwardly, you know what they're trusting in? They're trusting in the fact that they have this glorious, beautiful temple. They have their ceremonies. They have their religious ceremonies, their religious worship. And they're trusting in that. They're saying, yeah, we might be corrupt, we might be evil, but look what we have here in this temple. Look at our religious practices. Look at our ceremonies. Look at the rituals that we have, the things that we go through. So they thought that they were secure because of their religion and temple. And again, I can't help but to think there's a lot of this as far as, even think of this, the life of the Christian is to what? To love God and to love man. That's the life of the Christian, right? And so we are saved not by our works. We mentioned this last week over and over again. We're not saved by our works. We're not saved by the fruit that's on the tree. But if we are in Christ, there will be fruit that takes place in our life. There'll be fruit that manifests itself from that. And so as you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, how easy it is to be outwardly religious. How easy it is to go through the motions of religiosity, and you're going through these things, and you've read all the right books, and you're listening to the right podcasts, but then when you actually investigate and you realize, okay, what do you have? You have bitterness, you have jealousies, you have rivalries, you have factions, you have pride. You have all these really abominable things that are in the hearts of man, and we get that even as God's people. That's something we're fighting against, right? Well, here's the difference. In Jeremiah's day, they're excusing it, they're deflecting it, they're avoiding it, they're denying it. That's the problem. See, that's not the heart of somebody who knows God. The heart of somebody who knows God is very aware of these inward maladies that afflict us. And so we repent, we turn, we're growing, we're seeking to, it's called evangelical obedience. We're seeking to do God's will, not to earn anything, but because God has saved us and we want to, out of gratitude, live in this way. But what was happening in Jeremiah's day is they were outwardly religious, but when you actually investigate what's going on in their heart, it was very clear that they didn't know God. Remember what God himself says, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Titus 1 says, by their deeds, they say professing to know God, by their deeds they deny God. By their deeds, right? They profess all day long, they know God, but by their deeds they deny God. And I can't help, I mean, when we were going through the thing at Rudy's house, and we went and we talked to the city, and afterwards we got to meet all of Rudy's neighbors. And lo and behold, Rudy's neighbors could not believe that we would have the audacity to start a church in a house. And they were so upset. And they were all Christians, by golly, right? But why, it's like, well, why can't you just go to another church over here? Like, I go to church every Sunday and I don't have to. And it's like, man, I mean, I've never been in a situation where the street is packed with people going to a house church. I get it. But if I was, I would hope I would rejoice, and do what I can to help that out. I mean, I don't know. But that's what's going on. And so when we used to, I remember one time we were evangelizing outside of London. And it was, where they have I think it's called Wimbledon, where they do the Wimbledon tennis and all that. So we were evangelizing in that area. One of the worst experiences in my life as far as evangelism goes, because everybody there, I mean, they're probably all millionaires, and they're walking through there. I've never encountered harder soil as far as just sharing the gospel goes than out there. And they were all Christians, Church of England, Anglican, all of that. And we were encountering people left and right saying, well, I don't have a problem with sin. I don't sin. I don't struggle with that. Are you a good person? Well, of course I'm a good person. Have a good day. It's like, man, so that's what Jeremiah's going through. And I'm saying this because in our own day, we go through this as well. In our own hearts, we can go through this. It's so easy for us to puff ourselves up and to say, well, I go to church and I've read my John Calvin, so I must be good. Right? But that's outward. Now, going to church and reading John Calvin is good. But there's a lot of people who go to church and read John Calvin who end up in hell. Because it's all outward. It's all external. That's what's going on in the days of Jeremiah. And what is Christ doing? He's saying that's what's going on in his day. That's what the Pharisees have become. That's what the Sadducees have become. Verse 18. And this is why they're upset. This leads us to the last part. The chief priests and the scribes heard this and began seeking how to destroy him. Not because he stalled out the financial system in the temple. Again, the temple's way too big for one man to come in there and cause everything to come to a grinding halt. It's much more than that. It's because, you know what they realize? This guy is declaring himself to be the king of the temple, the Lord of the temple, Yahweh, who has come in the flesh. They're realizing this is what he's claiming, and not only is he claiming that, but look what happens. They were afraid of him, for the whole crowd was astonished at his teaching. Not only are they realizing he's claiming that, but the people are actually listening to this man. Now there's a bigger problem. There's a new sheriff in town. They realize this. Now we're being threatened by this one man. Now we have to kill him. We have to take him out. That's what the problem is. So as you look at this, I mean, here's when you talk about, remember like a month ago when we were talking about there were two ways. When Christ comes into Jerusalem, he makes sure that everybody knows what he is saying, that he is the new king. Remember before he comes to Jerusalem and he tells everybody not to say anything? But then he comes into Jerusalem and there's two things he does that he wants everyone to notice him as far as what he's claiming. The first thing was when he comes in on a donkey and they're waving palms and everything, and that's what they did for the kings when they came into Jerusalem. That's the first thing. And they recognize that. Here's the second thing right here. When he comes into the temple and he investigates and he says, listen, the fruit that I was looking for is not there. So what's he setting himself up as? The Lord of the temple. He's the one who judges what's going on in the temple, and the temple has been found wanting. The religious authorities at that time, they're found wanting, and so now what are they going to do? They're going to come out and try to kill him. And so again, it's like, okay, they want Christ, they just don't want the real Christ. And how many times in our culture, in our American Bible Belt culture, is that the fact? I want Christ, but not the real Christ. We met somebody at the mall yesterday. They want Christ, but not on his terms. They don't want the real Christ. And so as God's people, we need the thing is, praise God if you are in Christ, that that He has had mercy on us, that He's given us eyes to behold Him, a love in our heart for Him, a love in our heart for each other, a love in our heart for even our enemies, even when it's tough. And at the same time, as God's people, we can still reflect and check those areas when we do start to lose sight of what the focus is and what the mission is, and also any kind of false hypocrisy or false religiosity, external kind of stuff only. Those two things that we can watch out for. And then if you're not in Christ, I mean, here's the thing too. There's two sides, you know. So you either follow Christ or you don't follow Christ. The true Christ, there's the true Christ, and then there's all the other Christs. And so this is a time too to examine yourself and see where you are with the Lord. I mean, are you right with the Lord? Do you know that you're right with the Lord? And if not, I mean, all of these things, always come and talk to us anytime you have any of these eternal questions. There's nothing more important than these eternal questions. What side of the fence are you on? Do you follow Christ? Are you for Him or not? And although we can't tell you that as humans, ministers, churches, we can't tell you what side you're on. We can certainly help you walk along that path, and the Lord can show things to you. He's given us promises in His Word. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. That Christ laid down His life for who? For His people, whoever you are, whatever background, whatever situation you come out of, whatever sins. I mean, it's always encouraging when you go to people and you can say, I don't care what you have done in your life. Like Jeffrey Dahmer. The college students can't figure out how God would actually accept Jeffrey Dahmer into heaven. And I'm not saying he is, but you know, he did make a profession of faith, and it's like, well, in the same way that He's saved any one of us God haters, in the same way, through the blood of Jesus Christ. So whatever you've done, no matter how evil you think you are, or especially, maybe even more importantly or more dangerously, no matter how evil you don't realize you are, realize that Christ has laid down His life for His people, for anyone who calls upon His name, for anyone who comes to Him by faith. So there's good news there. All right, let's pray and then we'll come to the table.